John sat at the kitchen table, the sun barely peeking through the blinds, casting a muted glow on the scattered papers and coffee cups. His eyes wandered over his work, but his mind was elsewhere. His hand reached for the half-empty mug, the warmth of it doing little to settle the growing unease in his chest. It had been a week since Lily had started acting differently. He noticed it first in the way she would rush through her morning routine, barely acknowledging him. She'd always been the one to make the kids breakfast, the one who smiled at him over the top of her coffee cup. Now her eyes seemed distant, her smile absent. John couldn't place it. There was no argument, no glaring issue, but something had changed. He watched as Lily bustled around the kitchen, not for the first time ignoring him. Her movements were sharp, almost robotic, as if she was trying to avoid making any unnecessary noise. The tension in the air was palpable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? "John, I'm going to run to the store after work," Lily called out, her voice flat, distracted. John nodded, his thoughts swirling. She hadn't looked him in the eye. It was as if she were speaking to someone else entirely, a ghost of the woman he used to know. He stood up, clearing his throat, desperate to reconnect, to fill the void between them. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness like an unwelcome intruder. Lily froze for a moment, her back still turned to him as she packed the kids' lunches. She didn't respond right away, and when she finally spoke, it felt rehearsed. "Yeah, just a lot going on," she said, her voice quieter than usual. But the lack of sincerity made John's stomach churn. The silence that followed was heavy. He could hear the soft shuffle of their children's feet as they ran through the hallway, playing with their toys, blissfully unaware of the tension that clouded the air. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, he knew it wasn't just about her being tired or busy. Later that night, as they lay in bed, the gap between them seemed wider than ever. He could feel Lily's back facing him, her body stiff and distant. Her breathing was shallow, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. He reached for her hand, hoping for a touch that would restore some semblance of the intimacy they once shared. But she withdrew, turning further away. The rejection stung more than he expected. "Lily." His voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to make her stiffen. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Lily didn't respond, and the silence between them grew. He tried again. "I don't know what's happening, but it feels like you're slipping away from me." There was a long pause, and John could feel her body tense up even more. He didn't expect an answer, but part of him hoped she would finally open up. "I'm just tired, John," she said, her voice small and almost apologetic. But John knew it wasn't just fatigue. He felt it in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way her hand no longer lingered on his when they were together. It was subtle, but it gnawed at him, and deep down, he felt it in his gut. The next morning, John left for work early, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. As he stepped out the door, he turned back to find Lily standing by the window, staring out, lost in thought. She didn't notice him watching her, her gaze distant, almost longing. He closed the door behind him with a heavy heart. Something was wrong, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face it yet. John's thoughts had been preoccupied all day, but the moment he walked through the door that evening, they came crashing down on him again. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in her hands, staring down at it as if the world around her didn't exist. He paused in the doorway, watching her. She hadn't even noticed him come in. He cleared his throat and she glanced up, her eyes quickly shifting away. The brief moment of eye contact felt distant, as though she were looking through him rather than at him. "Hey," John said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Lily replied quickly, almost too quickly. She fumbled with the phone in her hands, tapping on the screen before slipping it into her pocket. A small part of John noticed that it was the second time today she had done that. First in the morning, and now again at night. She was hiding something. His suspicion only deepened. "Are you sure?" he pressed, walking into the room. He could feel the air between them thickening. "You've been acting strange lately." Lily stiffened, her face momentarily betraying a flicker of guilt, but she recovered quickly, the mask of indifference settling back into place. "I'm just tired, John," she said, standing up to pour herself a glass of water. Her back was turned to him, her voice as flat as ever. "Work's been exhausting. You know how it is." John's mind raced. Her words didn't match the weight of her actions. There was something off about her tone. She wasn't just tired. He had seen it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the way she fidgeted with her phone, how she withdrew more and more into herself every day. Before he could respond, her phone buzzed again, an incoming message. John's instinct kicked in. His heart skipped a beat, and before he could stop himself, he reached over and snatched it up off the counter. "What's this?" he asked, looking at her, his voice barely a whisper. He felt the tension in his chest tighten. Lily's face drained of color, her eyes widening in shock. "John, give me that," she said sharply. But John didn't move. He glanced down at the screen, his heart sinking deeper into his stomach. The message was from Mark. The message read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you so much." The words burned into his brain. Mark. The name from the back of his mind now had a face, a presence, a weight he hadn't fully realized until that very moment. Lily stood frozen for a beat, the silence stretching between them. The truth was out in the open. John felt his whole world shift, as if the ground beneath him was crumbling away. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with betrayal. I can explain," Lily stammered, her voice now trembling. Her defenses were slipping. "It's not what you think." John's hands were shaking. He turned toward her, the phone still in his hand, the weight of it a cruel reminder of the secret she had been hiding. "Explain?" he asked, his voice low but full of a quiet fury. "How do you explain this?" Lily looked down, unable to meet his gaze. She looked so small in that moment, so lost, and yet the emptiness inside John was even larger than her shame. His stomach twisted in knots. How long had she been lying to him? How many nights had she gone to sleep beside him, all the while holding this secret? "I didn't mean for it to happen, John," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I feel alone." The words struck John like a slap to the face. Alone? After everything they had built, everything they had shared. "Alone?" he repeated, his voice cracking. "You felt alone because I was working too much? You felt alone so you went to someone else?" Her eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She swallowed hard, trying to hold on to her composure. "I didn't want this, but he understood me, John. He made me feel alive again." John felt like he was suffocating. Alive? After everything, she was telling him that another man made her feel alive. The betrayal was overwhelming, crushing him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Alive," John repeated bitterly, throwing the phone down onto the table. "So that's it then? That's your excuse for throwing away everything we've had?" Lily looked away, unable to meet his eyes. She had no defense left. The guilt was written all over her face. John stood there for a long moment, his body tense with anger, hurt, and disbelief. His mind screamed at him to do something, to say something more. But the words were stuck. He opened his mouth, but all he could do was mutter, "I can't believe this." The house felt colder than it ever had. The walls closed in on him, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on his chest. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, unable to bear being in the same room as her any longer. He needed air. He needed space. But as he reached the door, he heard her voice, weak and broken. "I never wanted to hurt you, John. I never wanted this." John paused, his hand on the door, but he didn't turn around. It was too late. The silence in the house was deafening. John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, the screen still glowing with Mark's text. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you so much." The words felt like a punch to his gut. His hands shook as he reread them over and over, as though the reality of what was happening would somehow sink in if he just stared long enough. Lily's footsteps echoed in the hallway, drawing nearer. She hadn't even tried to hide it. The betrayal was too blatant, too real, and the weight of it was crushing him. He didn't need her to explain. He already knew everything. but he had to hear it from her. He had to see her face as she admitted it, because something in him still couldn't accept that this was his life now, this twisted, broken version of what it used to be. "Lily," he said, his voice cold, unfamiliar. His tone was a stark contrast to the warmth they once shared. "What is this?" Lily stopped just outside the kitchen. She didn't come in. Her voice wavered when she spoke, almost pleading. "John, Don't." John cut her off, standing up abruptly. "I don't want to hear any more lies." His chest tightened, and he struggled to control the anger that was beginning to rise. He grabbed the phone from the table and threw it onto the counter, his hands still shaking. "How long, Lily? How long has this been going on?" Lily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood there frozen, as if the truth were too heavy for her to bear. And maybe it was, but the longer she stood in silence, the more the rage inside John grew. He had to know. He needed the truth. "How long?" John repeated, his voice louder now, sharper. His anger was boiling over, but beneath it was a deeper, more vulnerable pain. A pain he didn't know how to escape from. Finally, Lily stepped into the room, her eyes downcast. She couldn't meet his gaze. "A few months," she whispered, barely audible. "I didn't want it to happen, John. I didn't mean for you to find out like this." John staggered back as if he'd been struck. A few months. He had spent all this time, this precious time, thinking everything was normal. He had worked late, missed dinner with his family, thinking his home was a sanctuary, not a house crumbling under the weight of lies. "A few months," he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. His chest was tight with the heaviness of her confession. "You've been lying to me for months, Lily? Lying to our children? To this family?" Lily's face flushed with shame, but she didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already spilled out, and now there was nothing but the wreckage left in its wake. John paced across the room, running his hand through his hair in disbelief. He didn't know where to put his anger, his hurt, his betrayal. It all felt like it was suffocating him. His thoughts were a blur, but one question kept repeating itself. How could she do this to him? "Why?" he asked, finally stopping in his tracks, his voice breaking. "Why, Lily? After everything we've been through, why him?" Lily's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them quickly, but the damage was already done. "I felt so alone, John. You were always working, and I needed someone who saw me. I thought I could handle it, but then I couldn't stop. It wasn't supposed to go this far." John laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and empty. "So this is my fault because I worked too much? Because I gave you everything, but you wanted more?" The pain in his voice cut through the room, raw and unapologetic. He had given her everything. He had worked hard, provided, loved her through thick and thin. But somehow that wasn't enough. Mark had made her feel seen, had given her something John hadn't known how to give her anymore. "No," Lily whispered, shaking her head. "It's not like that, John. I'm sorry. I don't want to hurt you." John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the tears he had been holding back started to fall. His world was crumbling. Every moment of trust, every memory of their years together felt like a lie now. And the worst part was that he couldn't even be angry at Mark. He didn't know Mark. He didn't know who to blame. He turned away, staring out the window, fighting to regain control. "I don't know how to do this," he muttered. "I don't know how to keep pretending everything's fine when it's all falling apart." Lily took a step forward, her voice shaking. "John, please. I still love you. I don't want to lose our family." Her words sounded hollow. He could see the tears in her eyes, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Everything they had built, it was all gone now, and nothing she said could undo it. John didn't respond. He couldn't. He just stood there, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on him, suffocating him. There was no more fight left in him. The woman he thought he knew had vanished, and in her place was someone he didn't recognize. His heart was broken, but he didn't know how to heal it. John's hands were clammy, his breath shallow as he stood at the door of Mark's office. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn around, but he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. The pain of betrayal had festered long enough. He was done with silence, done with pretending he didn't know. The door opened in front of him and Mark stood there, a smug grin plastered across his face as if he were expecting this moment. "John," Mark said, his voice oozing with false politeness. "I didn't expect you to pay me a visit. What can I do for you?" John stared at him, fury building with each passing second. Mark looked unbothered, casual, like he didn't have a care in the world. It enraged John. How could someone be so cold, so indifferent to the devastation they had caused? This man had taken his wife, no, not just his wife, he had taken everything that mattered. "You're the man who's been sleeping with my wife," John said, his voice low but fierce. His pulse pounded in his ears. Mark didn't flinch. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, completely unruffled. And what of it? He shrugged as if they were discussing nothing more than the weather. "Lily made her choice, John. You can't blame me for that." John's breath caught in his throat. The arrogance was overwhelming. This man wasn't even ashamed. There was no remorse, no guilt. He wasn't just confident, he was smug. Mark was enjoying this, enjoying watching John squirm in the wake of his betrayal. "How long?" John demanded. "How long has this been going on?" Mark raised an eyebrow as if John had asked something trivial. "A while," he said nonchalantly. "A few months, give or take. Why? Does it matter? You knew, didn't you?" The words cut through John like a blade. How dare he? This wasn't just about sex or a fling. It was about the betrayal of a lifetime. Mark was treating it like some casual affair. It was as if John and Lily's entire marriage meant nothing. "Don't act like this is some game," John snapped, stepping forward, the anger bubbling inside him. "You destroyed my family." Mark's lips curled into a half smile, his confidence never wavering. "I didn't destroy anything, John. You did. You and your work. You were never there. You were too busy to see what was right in front of you. Lily needed someone who understood her, someone who would see her." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I gave her that. You couldn't." John stood there, stunned, as Mark's words sank into him. He couldn't even deny it. Mark was right. He had been absent. Too focused on work, too blind to see that his wife was struggling. But even if that was true, did that give Mark the right to step in? To take what wasn't his? No, it didn't. "You don't get it," John said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. "You don't get to take everything from me and act like you're the hero here." Mark pushed off from the doorframe and stepped closer, his tone condescending. "John, I'm not the villain in this story. You are. You've been so caught up in your career that you didn't notice your wife slipping away. You were never there for her. She came to me when you were too busy to care. That's on you." The words hit John like a physical blow. It was the final insult. Mark was right about one thing. John had been so focused on building a life for them that he hadn't seen Lily slipping through his fingers. But to blame him for what Mark had done? No, that wasn't fair. John's hands clenched into fists. The urge to lash out was overwhelming, but he knew better. This man didn't deserve his anger. He was beneath him, and John couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "I'm done with you," John said through gritted teeth, his voice cold. "Stay the hell away from my family." Mark smiled again, that same infuriating smile. "I'm not the one who has to worry about that, John. Lily made her choice, and honestly, I think you already know it." John didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. The truth was out. It hurt, and it was hard to swallow, but the reality of it was inescapable. Lily had chosen him. Mark didn't wait for a reply. He walked back toward his desk, picking up a glass of water as if nothing had happened, as if his actions didn't tear lives apart. John turned, his heart heavy, and walked out of the office. Mark's arrogance, his smugness, haunted him as he left. The world had shifted beneath his feet, and the weight of the betrayal felt unbearable. The hardest part, though, was knowing that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he fought, he could never take back what had been lost. His wife had chosen another man, and that truth was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The house was eerily quiet. The sound of John's own footsteps echoed through the hallway as he walked into the living room, still trying to process the conversation with Mark. Every word, every exchange between them had only left him more broken, more lost. But this was different. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It wasn't even about Lily's betrayal. It was about what was coming next. And John wasn't ready for it. He had thought that once he confronted Mark, once the truth was out in the open, there would be some closure. He would have a sense of finality. But instead, it felt like his world had only started to unravel. It wasn't long after he returned from the office that Lily began packing. Packing, as if nothing had happened, as if the shattered pieces of their life together could just be packed up into boxes and carried away, leaving the wreckage behind. John stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her. Her back was to him as she folded clothes, moving with mechanical precision. The woman he loved, the woman who had been his everything, was so distant now that she might as well have been a stranger. She didn't even look at him, not once. He wanted to speak, to stop her, but the words got caught in his throat. Instead, he just watched in silence, a cold knot forming in his chest. He could barely breathe. "Lily," he finally said, his voice quieter than he intended, a tremor in it that he couldn't hide. "Where are you going?" Lily paused, her shoulders tense. She didn't turn to face him right away. It took a long moment before she finally faced him, her eyes dull, resigned. "I'm leaving," she said simply, as though she were telling him she was running errands. "I'm going with Mark. We're moving in together." John's heart sank. Moving in together. The word stung worse than anything he'd ever felt before. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. He looked at her, trying to understand how she could be so calm, so detached. After everything, after all they had been through together, this was how it ended. No fight, no argument, just her walking away. "You can't just leave," he managed to say, his voice breaking. "You can't just—" He stopped, his words faltering, unable to find the right ones. Lily's expression softened, but it wasn't the warmth he was used to. It was pity. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, the words heavy with regret. "But it's over. I've made my decision." John shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "After everything we've been through, you're just leaving, just like that." Lily stepped toward him, her eyes filled with a sadness that almost seemed genuine, but it only made the pain worse. "I didn't want to hurt you. I never did. But I can't stay in a marriage that's falling apart. You weren't there for me, John, and I needed someone who would be." The words cut through him like a knife. The accusations, the truth, burned. She was right in a way. He had been consumed by his work, and maybe that had driven her to find someone else, but it didn't make it hurt any less. John took a step back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The room felt smaller, suffocating. It wasn't just the weight of her words, but the finality in them that tore at him. He didn't know what to do, how to stop this, how to fix it. Lily's hand hovered over the suitcase on the bed. Her fingers trembled as she zipped it closed, sealing her decision. "I'm taking the kids," she said quietly, her voice breaking for the first time. But her tears were not for him. They were for herself. She was already gone. John's stomach dropped at the words. "You can't take them, Lily. You can't just leave with them." His voice rose, the panic setting in. "I have to, John. I can't stay here anymore." Her voice was steady, but her eyes, her expression told a different story. She was torn, but the decision had already been made. The choice was final. He reached out, but she stepped back, her body stiff, her eyes full of something, fear, regret, maybe guilt, but also something else, indifference. She was done. She had made her choice. "Lily, please," he said, his voice cracking. "Please don't do this. Don't take them from me." His words felt like a plea, but he knew deep down that it wouldn't change anything. "I'm sorry, John," she repeated. "I never wanted it to end like this." John watched as she walked past him, suitcase in hand, heading for the door. The finality of it all hit him like a wave. She was leaving. She was taking everything. "Goodbye," she said softly, and with that, she was gone. John stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, his heart shattered. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. His hands trembled as he reached for the empty space beside him. It was like he had lost everything in a single moment, his wife, his family, his future. And yet there was nothing left to do but watch her leave. The door closed behind her with a finality that left him breathless. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with tension as John sat at the table staring down at the papers before him. The walls seemed to close in as he listened to his lawyer's voice, but it wasn't the legal jargon that made his heart race. It was the presence of Lily across the room, her back straight, her face composed but filled with silent determination. She hadn't even looked at him. John had never imagined that he'd end up here, fighting for his children, for his life, in a room where every word felt like a battlefield. Lily had left. She had taken the children and walked out of their home without a second glance. Now, this legal fight, this separation, was the only way left for John to have any claim on his family. The stakes had never been higher. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. It was a blur of legal terms, back-and-forth arguments, and statements. But John's mind was elsewhere. It was on Aiden, Olivia, and Sophia, his children, the only thing that truly mattered now. Lily's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who had done little to hide his disdain for John, made his opening statement. "Your Honor, Mr. Thomas has failed in his duties as a husband, and we believe his failure as a husband reflects poorly on his role as a father. He has neglected his family by prioritizing work over the well-being of his wife and children." John felt a surge of anger. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the blatant misrepresentation of his life. He had worked hard for his family, he had provided, he had sacrificed everything for them, and yet here he was, being painted as the villain in his own life. His lawyer objected, but the damage had been done. Lily's lawyer turned his focus to John's relationship with the children, digging deep into his hours at the office, highlighting the moments he missed. Every argument they made felt like another stab to his heart, but he had no choice but to sit there, listening to his failures being laid out in front of him. "You don't get to judge me," John muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for his lawyer to hear. But his words weren't meant for the lawyer. They were meant for Lily. She was the one who had chosen Mark over him. She was the one who had left their family, torn it apart. Yet here she sat, in her perfectly pressed clothes, acting as if she were the one who had been wronged. The day dragged on, each moment adding more weight to John's shoulders. He didn't want to fight, not like this. He didn't want to be in this courtroom. He just wanted his children back. He just wanted his family to be whole again. But the words, the accusations, and the coldness from both Lily and her lawyer kept pushing him further into a corner. Finally, Lily took the stand. John tried to look at her without feeling the anger twist in his gut, but he couldn't. She was the woman who had pledged to be by his side forever, and now she was the woman sitting in front of him, making his life a nightmare. She told the judge about how she had felt neglected, how John's work had driven a wedge between them. She spoke of how Mark had been there for her, how she had found comfort in someone who truly understood her needs. And then, in a move that almost seemed calculated, she told the judge, "I want what's best for my children. I'm the one who can provide that for them." The words stung, but they also pushed John to the edge. He hadn't realized just how much pain he was still carrying until her words hit him. He had given everything to their family, and now it was being thrown back in his face. John's lawyer stood up and began to cross-examine Lily. The questions were sharp, aimed at showing her inconsistency and her lack of commitment to the marriage. But all John could do was sit there, his mind swirling. The lawyer's questions felt like they were being directed at someone else. Someone who had hurt him, betrayed him, not the man he had once been. His life was being dissected, analyzed, picked apart, and it was all happening right in front of him. When it was his turn to speak, John didn't know what to say. The words had caught in his throat, trapped by the anger, sadness, and disbelief. The pain of it all hit him like a wave. He stood up, taking a breath, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "I love my children. I would do anything for them. I've worked hard my whole life to provide for them. But I've failed as a husband. I admit that. But I will not fail as a father." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and for the first time that day, John felt his resolve harden. This was not about him and Lily anymore. This was about his children. He wasn't going to let them be used as pawns in their fight. He couldn't. As the proceedings continued, John felt a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't fighting for the past anymore. He was fighting for the future. The legal battle was far from over, but this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment he decided that no matter what, he was going to win back his children. The judge called for a recess, and as the room emptied, John looked at Lily, but she didn't meet his gaze. She wasn't looking at him anymore. The person she had been was no longer there, and maybe, just maybe, that was the hardest thing of all. John had barely begun to process the grueling days in court when the shocking news came. The fight for custody was wearing him down. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, but it was still his children's future he was fighting for. The moment he had feared most was here. It was a quiet morning when it happened. The courtroom was filled with the usual tension as both sides made their final arguments, but something in the air felt heavier than usual. John sat at the table, his eyes locked on Lily, who was seated across from him. For the first time in a while, she was looking at him, her expression filled with contempt. He couldn't read it, but it didn't matter. She was determined, and so was he. Just as the judge was about to rule, Lily's lawyer stood up, a smug look on his face, making his way to the judge's bench. John's lawyer shifted in his seat. Something was off. "I'd like to present new evidence," Lily's lawyer said, his voice sharp. The room fell silent, all eyes on him as he handed the judge a set of papers. The tension in the room skyrocketed. John's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for, something that would change everything. The judge nodded and flipped through the papers. "I see. This is unexpected." He looked up at John. "Mr. Thomas, do you have any knowledge of this?" John's eyes narrowed. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily's lawyer smiled, his eyes glinting with victory. "We've uncovered evidence of a previous criminal record, one that Mr. Thomas was not forthcoming about." The words hit John like a truck. A criminal record? It felt surreal, like a cruel joke. He felt the blood drain from his face. His mind raced to understand what this new accusation could possibly mean. Lily's lawyer continued, spinning the lie. "Mr. Thomas has been convicted of assault. He has a violent history that, according to his file, he failed to disclose. This is critical information, Your Honor. We believe it should be taken into consideration in this custody battle." John froze. How could this happen? How could a lie like this, something so drastic, be thrown into the mix? His mind was spinning, trying to understand how this could have happened. He had never been involved in any violent incident. There had been nothing that could lead to this accusation. He turned to his lawyer, but before he could speak, his lawyer was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this is absolutely untrue. There is no record, no basis for these allegations. This is a complete fabrication." But the damage had already been done. Lily had planted the seed, and the courtroom's attention was now on John, not on his dedication as a father, not on his love for his children. They were questioning his character. "Your Honor," the lawyer continued, "I'm sure you'll agree that a man with a history of violence should not be given full custody of children, especially when there's evidence he could pose a danger to them." John's stomach turned. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of judgment pressing down on him. The truth seemed so far away, and yet here he was, caught in a web of lies, struggling to defend himself against something that didn't even exist. The judge didn't speak immediately. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before he finally addressed John. "Mr. Thomas, how do you respond to these allegations?" John was speechless for a moment. He could barely catch his breath. He tried to steady himself, but everything felt out of control. The ground beneath him was shaking. "I don't know what this is," John said, his voice shaking but firm. "I've never been convicted of anything. This is a lie. I don't know where this is coming from." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. "We will need to investigate this further. This may affect the custody decision. I'm afraid we'll have to postpone the ruling." John felt his world shatter in that moment. All the hope he had held onto for this day, the one he had been fighting for, was slipping through his fingers like sand. A false accusation, a new weapon in the battle. It was all too much. His heart raced and his mind screamed in disbelief. But Lily's lawyer wasn't done. He had seen the cracks in John's defense and wasn't going to let go. He turned to the judge, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "In light of this new information, Your Honor, we request a more thorough examination of Mr. Thomas's background, as well as a temporary custody arrangement. We can't allow the children to be in his care until we resolve this matter." John's stomach twisted with dread. He could see Lily sitting quietly, her face impassive, but the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. This was her moment, wasn't it? The judge nodded, and John's lawyer stood to protest, but the judge's words were final. "The matter will be reviewed and temporary custody will be decided shortly. Court is adjourned." John sat there in stunned silence as the room began to empty out. His children, his future, were now in the hands of others. He couldn't understand how things had escalated to this point. He had thought the worst was over after the affair had been revealed, after the confrontation with Mark. But this was something else. It was a game-changing blow, and John had no idea how to fight it. The door to the courtroom slammed shut behind him as he stood, numb. He had no answers, no way forward. Just a crushing, unbearable weight of uncertainty. John stared at the judge as the final ruling was read aloud, each word weighing down on him like 1,000 pounds. His lawyer had been relentless in defending him, but after the chaos of the false accusations and the twists that had come in the previous weeks, John hadn't been sure how the decision would land. He barely heard the judge's words as they passed through him, drowning in the noise of his own thoughts. And then he heard it. "Full custody awarded to Mr. Thomas." The words broke through his haze, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. His chest tightened and his heart raced. It was over. He had won. The judge's gavel echoed through the room as if confirming the finality of it all. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest for months, ever since Lily walked out, lifted just a fraction. But it felt like the heaviest breath he had taken in a long time. He turned to his lawyer, who smiled and gave him a nod. But even with the victory, John's relief was tempered by the exhaustion of everything he had been through. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. His gaze shifted to the back of the courtroom, where Lily sat with her arms crossed, a look of disbelief on her face. Her lawyer was speaking rapidly beside her, but John could see it, the defeat in her eyes, the realization that she had lost this fight. Her world, her carefully constructed plan, was falling apart. For a moment John felt pity, but it was fleeting. She had made her choice. She had chosen Mark, and she had chosen to tear apart their family. The emotions were mixed. There was relief, of course, but also an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He had won the battle, but the war had already taken its toll. His marriage was over, his family had been shattered, and it felt like he had no idea who he was anymore. John drove home alone, the silence in the car almost deafening. The world outside was moving on, but in his mind, everything felt still, like the echo of the final gavel. When he walked through the door, everything was different. The house, once filled with the noise and mess of family life, was now quiet. The children were at their grandmother's for the night, but even so, the emptiness was palpable. He stepped into the living room and sank into the couch. His body felt heavy, like it had been carrying a weight for too long. But now that the fight was over, he didn't know what to do with himself. His body ached, his mind raced. But the one thing he had to keep reminding himself was that this was the beginning of healing, not the end. It was quiet for a while before his phone buzzed, a message from his lawyer. He read it, and the words seemed almost surreal. "Your children are yours. Take care of them." It was a relief. It should have been the moment he felt fully free. But the only thing he felt was the long road ahead. His children were his now, and they were the only thing that mattered. He thought about them, Aiden, Olivia, and Sophia, and the pain they had been through. They would never be the same. Their world, too, had been shattered, but they had him now, and he was going to be there for them no matter what. Later that evening, when the kids came home, the first thing Aiden did was run into his arms. John squeezed him tight, his son's little body warm and comforting against him. "Dad, we're home," Aiden said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. John closed his eyes for a moment, holding him close, and then looked at his children. His family. This was the moment of clarity he had been waiting for. No matter what had happened, no matter what had been lost, he had them now. "Welcome home," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next few weeks, John settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of everything still hit him hard. But the moments with his children brought a sense of purpose he had been lacking for so long. He worked hard to rebuild what had been broken, working with his kids to create new routines, taking them out on weekends, helping with homework, and simply being there. It wasn't perfect, but it was a fresh start, one that he could give his children. As he watched his children laugh together, playing in the yard, John knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but it wouldn't be one he had to walk alone, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe. There was hope again. What do you think of John's actions? Was he right to fight so hard for his children after everything that happened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, what's your score for this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And if you're looking for more heartwarming tales, click here on the end screen to check them out.